All right, so welcome YouTube. It's Clear Vision Wednesday time. I'm Claudia Muehlenweg, natural vision improvement expert and founder or creator of the Naturally Clear Vision Method. And today we have a very cool topic, which I think so many relate to. And the title of this talk today is, or this interview today is Commonly Ignored Reasons for Focus Problems in Feeling ADD with my special guest, Dana Kay. And before I introduce her, I do want to say that this is not the clinical diagnosis right now. When I say feeling ADD, it's that feeling that you cannot focus, that you are 1,000 things. And that's how I felt all morning this morning after my computer crashed. And I was like in this crazy state. So Dana is actually an expert in ADHD. I always have to say that super slow. And she is the founder of the ADHD Thrive Institute. And she will share with us like what kind of some of the root causes can be. And Dana is mostly focused on working with children and their families in this case, but this really also applies to adults. And Dana, I'm going to bring you on stage. And then my first question would really be, hold on, there you are. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, me too, because I love learning too from experts like you, because there's so many things to connect it to eyesight. So tell us a little bit, I always think this is interesting, like how did you get into this whole field, or why are you doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it's I think that a lot of us, when we get into these fields, we've got that story behind why we do what we do, and really, mine comes from having a child with ADHD, and I've got two boys, and my oldest son was diagnosed when he was 4, and going through that, all those challenges, it was so lonely. I was just angry and sad and just downright unhappy in my life when this was happening. And going through that, by the time he was 5, he was on 3 strong medications, and which was just, that's all I knew. I trusted the experts. I trusted in knowing that, that path forward was the path that we were meant to take. And the doctor actually handed me a prescription for a 4th medication. And at that point, that medication was just to treat the symptoms that were coming from the other medications. And at that point, I was like, hold on, this is not okay. My son's 5 and they want him on 4 strong medication. And so I decided that I was going to figure out how to help him in other ways. And it really just didn't matter how long it took me or what I had to do. And I made that decision right there and then that I was going to figure out how to reduce his symptoms with a natural approach. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely a time and place for medication, and I'm not totally against it, but to constantly increase the dose, adding new medications, to treat the symptoms of the other medication, that was not okay, in my opinion. And, that my whole journey really is what started me on the journey where, I am today, to my holistic health degree, multiple, specific certifications in this particular area, sharing my methodology with all of the families that I work with. So, they can sort of skip over that trial and error, that Googling that I went through. It was extremely, extremely difficult for me, and it just doesn't need to be that hard for other people. So that's my story.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I cannot even imagine how hard that must have been. I do want to come back to my introduction because, how I talked about, we're having this feeling of ADD. Everybody has a little bit of that. And I say ADD because it's also easier for me to say than ADHD. But, I'm curious, like when people say these kind of things, what are your thoughts on What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, look, I'm sure that many people listening today have felt that they can't focus for long, or they have so many different thoughts that they feel distracted or they forget things. I think I'll just take that step back and talk about what are the symptoms of ADHD, and I'm sure that many of the people listening have probably had some of those at some point in time. You know, disorganization and problems prioritizing things. Poor time management skills, problems focusing on one task. Sometimes I'm like that. I'm like, I feel like I've got, 10,000 things that I'm doing all at once, and trouble multitasking. What you would typically think of ADHD, especially for boys, is that excessive activity, that hyperactivity or restlessness, poor planning, low frustration or tolerance, or that impulsiveness. And I think that statement, it's probably referring to the fact that everyone exhibits some behaviors like the symptoms of ADHD every now and again, but doesn't necessarily mean they have that diagnosis of ADHD.
Okay, that's really interesting. But yeah, I felt this way this morning. And when you just described those things, I've definitely felt that way at times. Like what should I do first? And so I'm curious, you mentioned a little bit like multitasking, because I usually am not a fan of multitasking, and that's related to vision. But when you said something like people have problems multitasking, can you explain that a little bit more? And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so like I'll take it back to as women, a lot of women they're better at multitasking than men, but that's a generalization. But when you've got multiple things on, that multitasking is being able to focus on what you're doing right there and then without those other distractions of, oh my gosh, I've got to do this. Oh my gosh, I've got to do that. Sometimes, and it happens to me, I don't have diagnosis of ADHD, but when I've got multiple things on, I sometimes feel like all I'm doing is literally clicking around on my screen and doing absolutely nothing. I look back in the hour and I'm like, what have I done in the last hour? But it is the fact of not being able to handle multiple tasks at once and actually being productive in getting those tasks done.
That's this is exactly hitting on the head, because when we talk about eyesight, or what I usually share is from a vision perspective, that we can't really see two things clearly at once. And you said the same thing, focusing on one thing. And I always usually say the example of putting the other balls on the side, but you have them in your awareness, they're there, but you're focusing on this thing. And then it's interesting, because that's exactly how vision really works and how attention works. So I'm curious, you wear glasses. Is that, can you, is that something, because you're an expert in focus? So I'm curious.
Yeah, look, I don't have terrible vision. I spend a lot of time at the computer, and probably a big thing that you probably teach is, don't spend too much time in front of a screen. But, a big part of my day is spending in front of the screen. And so, I really do it to help my eyes more than anything. I've actually got pretty good vision. And, since I spend so much time in front of the computer, and I wear the glasses, it's sort of become part of who I am and who my brand is. And so I'm always, when I'm doing videos and doing on podcasts and going live in my Facebook group, I'm always wearing my glasses. And I think they're now part of my face. I look at myself in the mirror and I think, like, I take my glasses off, there you go. I look very, very different. And I actually prefer the way that I look with them on.
And I think that's an interesting point. That's not our topic today, but I think that's an interesting point, because I always say, glasses can be a style accessory, but you can still improve your vision and have just no correction in the glasses. But yeah, I see it. It's very different look. So yeah. Anyway, that was a little side note. I was curious about that. So can you talk a little bit more about the connection, since we talk about vision, clear vision and ADHD? I would like to learn a little bit more about that connection beyond the multitasking.
Yeah, look, a lot of people don't realize that vision disorders can sometimes mimic symptoms of ADHD, especially in children. And sometimes people are incorrectly diagnosed and actually even prescribed medication for ADHD, and which, you know, in my mind is like, oh my gosh, this kid has been incorrectly diagnosed. They've been prescribed a stimulant medication and they actually don't even have it. One example of this is with a vision problem called convergence insufficiency. And convergence insufficiency is a vision problem in which the eyes don't work together correctly. And it can create sort of like a double vision or a blurred vision. And I'm sure you know all about it. But imagine trying to read with this vision problem. It really wouldn't be much fun, especially as a child when you're trying to actually learn how to read, because of how difficult this vision problem makes reading. You know, many children learn to dislike it. And because they dislike reading, they fidget, they act out, they don't follow instructions, they don't focus on it, and they disobey during reading time. So really, even though their actions look like ADHD, they're fidgeting, unable to concentrate, moving around a lot, they are actually struggling with a vision problem instead. So if convergence insufficiency is the underlying stressor, it's very possible that vision therapy could make a huge difference in these ADHD symptoms.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So there's definitely this kind of connection, like chicken and egg. And sometimes also that goes for learning disabilities too, where sometimes the vision problem is the first or easiest thing to address, and then everything else falls into place. So what are, like, I'm curious, what are other root causes of ADHD? And also, are those the same root causes that make us feel like, you know, that ADD that we talked about, that we cannot focus on one thing, and we're not like bouncing off the walls like boys might be, but just kind of like, oh my God, I have so many things to do. And that was me this morning when my computer crashed. And so I was like, oh my God, what do I need to do first? So tell us a little bit more about what other, like, or what, how you actually address, you know, how you work with your children.
Definitely. This is like my favorite topic to discuss. So you're probably not going to be able to shut me up. But anyway, I just wanted to give you a really brief overview of a couple of things relating to the gut. And I know this doesn't sound like it's going to have to do with focus or vision problems, but it's so connected to how all of us function, especially those with focus issues or mood issues, whether you are diagnosed with ADHD or you just experience like inability to focus at different times and don't have a specific diagnosis. It can affect every part of our body. And many people don't realize how connected the gut is to the rest of the body. You know, a person's gut health is quite literally connected to every single thing that occurs in our body. 80% of the body's entire immune system is within the gut wall, along with billions of nerve cells and an extensive amount of bacteria, or beneficial bacteria, good bacteria. Now, there's also the gut-brain connection specifically, and this is probably the main area that, you know, affects that focus. There's a very close connection between the gut and the brain, and one of the first signs of disconnect in the brain is a gut that's not functioning well. Now, the brain has many areas that are involved in gut function, but one of the main areas is the frontal lobe, and it talks to the gut via nerve branches and two-way chemical messengers. Now, listen to this. The frontal lobe is involved in things like attention and focus and executive function and planning and organizing, problem solving. So if your gut is not working, you can totally see how you couldn't focus or that you couldn't pay attention. So really fix the gut and you fix the brain. But I also want to say that the gut's responsible for making 95% of our serotonin and 50% of our dopamine, which are our happy, feel-good sort of neurotransmitters or hormones in our body that help us sort of regulate our emotions and maintain our mood balance and also our cognitive function. So a lot of these areas people with ADHD struggle with, but also a lot of these areas people without ADHD struggle with as well. So again, I'm going to say fix the gut, fix the brain, and you fix the mood.
Wow, that is so interesting. I mean, it always comes back to the gut, but what are some, I'm just curious, what are some symptoms other than like the focusing, like the ones you talked about, you know, the disorganizing, not being able to focus? Are there other reasons why, like how you could differentiate between like there's a gut problem versus a visual problem, or anything else you want to add to that? I'm curious if there's anything for any listeners to be like, well, what should I do now? I mean, and that could go into a whole rabbit hole. I know that, but what can people do, or how can they know that the gut is the problem?
Yeah, look, and really interestingly, you might not necessarily have gut problems. So, and that's the interesting part. I've looked at like gut tests for over 1,000 different children, and probably only maybe 30% of them actually had physical gut symptoms. And so that's the hard thing. I think that the best way to look at it is if that focus issue is affecting your life, then look to the gut. And so, you know, I don't know if you've heard about leaky gut, but or the families, the people that are watching today, but leaky gut can basically affect all areas of the body. If you've got allergies, if you've got food sensitivities, if you've got, you know, a runny nose or problems with your eyes, if you get brain fog all the time, that could be as a result of leaky gut. So it doesn't necessarily have to actually come back to the gut symptoms for the gut to be the problem.
And when you say gut symptoms, just to be very clear, you mean like, you know, usually it's bloating, belly aches, burping, or any of those kind of things, right?
So bloating, gas, constipation, diarrhea, acid reflux, those sort of things. Feeling, you know, really bloated after eating certain foods. There can be multiple different, you know, gut symptoms, and you don't even need to have any of them to actually have that sort of a problem with that gut-brain connection.
Wow. So how can people figure this out? Like, and also are there other root causes, or is it basically the gut is like the one thing?
Yeah, look, there's definitely many other root causes. I could be here all day, but I am sure that you don't want to be here with me all day, so I'll try and keep it short. I'll just like touch on a couple. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that toxin exposure may be a major factor for the increase in disease over the last 15 years. Like the increase in disease has dramatically increased. And so, you know, you're probably thinking, okay, well, toxin exposure, you know, what are you talking about? Things like fluoridated water. There was one study that found states in the USA with a higher portion of artificially fluoridated water had a higher prevalence of ADHD. Now, that's just one study. There are plenty of other studies out there that focus on fluoridated water and other diseases as well. So that's one toxin that could be affecting it. Pesticides, herbicides, weed killers, they're another toxin. It can cause harmful effects on the body over an extended period. And, you know, usually following repeated exposure at low levels, you're probably thinking, okay, well, you know, I'm not exposed to high levels of pesticides in my daily life, but, you know, low doses don't always cause immediate effects, but over time, they can cause very serious, you know, illnesses. Organic food, non-organic food. If you're eating, you know, strawberries, for example, is one of the foods that are highly sprayed with pesticides. So if you eat strawberries every day, you're getting that low exposure to that toxin, and over time it builds up in your body. It's been linked to you know, the development of Parkinson's disease, asthma, depression, anxiety, ADHD, and even cancer. You know, I think that with a lot of our fruit and vegetables, we want to focus on buying organic for those.
Wow.
I'm going to mention one more thing. I know I could go on and on and on about this, but I'm going to mention one more toxin, and it's exposure to heavy metals. So things like mercury, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, lead. I could go on, but they tend to sort of bioaccumulate. And this means that even small concentrations of the chemical in a person can actually have damaging impact over time. And studies show that heavy metals in the body may be implicated in everything from Alzheimer's to cognitive decline, behavioral problems, kidney dysfunction, epilepsy, and even, cardiovascular disease. So it can severely affect brain health, which may result in changes in vision, focus, memory problems, irritability. So that, that's just a couple. I could go on and on, but hopefully, that's enough for you to get those juices flowing about what could be contributing to it.
No, thank you so much. I mean, that's just incredible. And I would assume that, because I always talk about how I hate when people say age-related this or this, and like you talked about accumulation. And I think all the safety tests are also always done for one thing, but they don't look at like the exposure that we have of all of these things. And I would guess with children, because I'm not an expert with children, with working with children. So I would think because their brains are still growing and their bodies are so little that a little bit that wouldn't even affect us as much would have a lot of damage for a child. So yeah. So what can people do? Like, this is like, okay, now we painted the horrible picture.
Yeah.
So what is actually something that you can do if you, either your family, your child, or maybe you find yourself being, like you said, scattered and not being able to focus? Like, what can people do?
Definitely. Look, I'll just touch on the toxins first, because, that's what I just talked about, but we really want to reduce toxin exposure in our life. And we can do that relatively easy once we know where the exposure is coming from. So, focusing on organic food versus non-organic food, testing your water for lead, testing it for all of these heavy metals. If you've got any metal fillings in your mouth, get them out ASAP. So reducing the toxins when you know where the exposure is coming from. But moving on to the biggest impact, if we're not feeding and looking after our guts, then our bodies won't be feeling and functioning optimally either. So I often think of it like this. When you're building a house, a solid foundation, it's not optional. It's a necessity. If you don't have that solid foundation, that house is not going to be very strong and it might fall down. And it's the same way with our bodies. So diet for me is definitely the foundation. If our diet is poor, we can never function at our best. And that's true for us adults, but it's also true for our children. And because of this, when I work with families of children with ADHD, the first issue I address is diet. I always encourage families to remove some of the most common inflammatory foods from their diets, things like gluten and dairy, and replace these with foods that are healthier alternatives, and really focusing on more whole foods rather than lots and lots of packaged foods. If we're able to heal the gut, then we're able to heal not just symptoms, but the underlying stresses as well. So diet is definitely where I always start, but for some people, their gut needs a lot more help. So for some people, it may be obvious that they have deeper gut problems because, as we discussed earlier, things like reflux and heartburn, bloating, diarrhea or constipation. And I've got families that actually come to me for guidance with their children's ADHD symptoms. And when I ask them whether their family history, they've got any sickness, people actually tell me that everyone's really fit and healthy. But when I sort of press a little bit forward and ask whether their child has suffered from any diarrhea or constipation, they often tell me they have. And they're actually surprised to learn that constipation, it's not healthy or normal. It may be very, very common, but it's actually a byproduct of an unhealthy gut. So for others, it might not be so obvious that they have deeper gut problems. And in both cases, we actually employ functional lab testing to be able to see what is actually going on inside the gut, so we can then develop a tailored protocol that not only changes the diet, lifestyle modifications like that toxin exposure reduction, and also natural supplementation.
Wow, that's really cool. So, but basically you're saying the first thing you're going to address is the diet, and then see if change is happening, and then you do, okay. What about sugar? You mentioned dairy and gluten, which I'm also definitely always educating about. What about sugar? To me, that's one of the biggest
Yeah,
problems.
definitely. Yeah, so sugar, we definitely focus on natural sugars rather than refined sugars, so things like honey, maple syrup, dates, those sort of things. But the recommended guidance is sort of 24 grams, or I think it's per day for children. I actually recommend half that amount. Children are not going to be able to cut sugar out completely together because of society and life these days.
That's what I was wondering about, right? I mean, we as adults, we can do that, but I never wished when my kids were little, but it's just so with school and then Halloween and Easter. And when you think about it, birthdays, every time, it's even when I'm on my phone, I have the emojis, when I send something message, it's always, celebrating alcohol. It's like birthdays, cakes. It's like, it's almost like incredibly difficult. So thank you so much. I'm wondering, so with these functional tests, what's the difference of a functional test, lab test, versus like I'm going to my doctor and have some blood drawn or some urine tested or stool tests?
Yeah. That's a good question. Now, a lot of the lab tests that, your traditional doctor will do, you'll go to LabCorp as like one of the main labs. They provide you the reference ranges. And so they might come back and say, oh, you're fine with zinc, you're not low. But functional is more focusing on optimum health rather than, oh, you fall within the ranges, you're fine. Now, our ranges are a lot different from what you would get from LabCorp. And that's because we are surveying healthy people rather than looking at a population of unhealthy people. So those ranges are developed from people that are going to their doctors with symptoms and are unhealthy. So I don't want to focus on, improving my health and focusing on those ranges. I want to focus on ranges that are actually taking me towards optimum health. And so a lot of the tests that we do aren't the traditional ones that you can actually get at the doctor. There are 4 that we focus on. I have access to, hundreds of different ones, but I prefer to start with these 4 because I want to actually look at what's going on in the whole body. I'll talk about 3 of them now. One of them is a bit more related to kids with ADHD. So I'll talk about 3, and these are great for anyone to do if you've got access to sort of more of a functional, holistic doctor or practitioner. Now, the first and most obvious one is that gut stool test. And it's really going to give you a clear picture of the state of the gut. So it looks for things like parasites and bacteria, worms, yeast overgrowth, but there are also some really good intestinal health markers that look at inflammation, immune system responses, leaky gut, like I talked earlier. Are you reacting to gluten, digestive enzymes, and are you digesting your fat well? We want you to be able to digest your fat well because it can really be absorbed in the body and get to the brain, to help the kids, but also to help with vision. You want that good fat going to where it needs to go. Now, the next test we use, and I will tell you the gut test that you can do at a doctor, they look at, such a small percentage of those markers that we're looking at. So they're really only looking at, the top 5 parasites that people might get. We're looking at way more than that. We're looking at much more, a lot of markers that, you won't get seen by that traditional doctor. The next test that we do is a food sensitivity test. And I just want to link gut function to this test because I think that's really important. So when we eat food, our gut breaks down that food into micronutrient size particles, and those particles go through the lining of our gut into our cells to give us the nutrients we need so we can function optimally. But, as I mentioned earlier, there is something called leaky gut, and leaky gut is basically the breakdown of the lining around the gut, and it forms these large holes in the lining. Now, when we eat food, even sort of the healthiest food, whether it's kale or whatever it may be, before the gut has had a chance to break it down, it can go through the holes in the gut into our bloodstream. Now, when something foreign goes into our bloodstream, our body recognizes it as a foreign object, thinks it's like a virus or a toxin or something, and it turns on this immune response and starts attacking it. But if that molecule is in fact a large food macronutrient or protein like kale or chicken or whatever it may be, then your immune system might start sending signals to create this immune response and start creating antibodies and start attacking it. Now, the body has a very, very great memory. So anytime that you eat that food again, your immune system sees it as dangerous and attacks it, and it causes more inflammation in your body and continues to further break down the lining of the gut. So all of this actually results in food intolerances. Something might have started leaky gut, whether it was toxin exposure or a parasite or antibiotics. We haven't even touched on antibiotics, but then leaky gut causes food intolerances, and the food intolerances continue to cause leaky gut. So it's this vicious cycle. So in order to heal the gut, you must remove these foods, or they're going to continue to break down the lining of the gut, and you're not going to be successful. Does that make sense?
Totally. This is so interesting. I definitely want to make sure that we got the name of those tests so we can put them in the chat later on.
Yeah, I will definitely.
And you had a third one you wanted to mention, right? There was one more.
Yeah. So I'll just mention that food test, it's a simple finger prick test done at home, and it looks at those inflammatory reactions in the body to certain foods. Now, the third test that we recommend to use is from a lab called Great Plains, and they do something called an organic acid test. It's a urine test. It's one of my favorite because it looks at over 70 different important markers in the whole body and how it's functioning. So it can show you the need for sort of specific nutrients such as B vitamins, further diet modification, your detoxification pathway. So you might have had exposure to these toxins or these heavy metals, but you can't detoxify them out of your body, and that's when they build up and cause problems. It's also looking at your neurotransmitters like your serotonin and your dopamine, like I mentioned before. Are they low? Are they high? How they're affecting your mood. It looks at oxidative stress, so the breakdown of cells in your body. It looks at yeast, mold, and a lot of other markers as well. So it's a really good bang for your buck test to give you a really good picture of how the body's functioning.
That's so super interesting. So I do want to actually say that again that you said earlier, because I think most people are not aware. My mom always comes to me like, oh, everything is normal. The lab ranges that traditional, medicine uses is the average of people that go to the doctor with symptoms, versus functional medicine looks at, and that's why you call it the Thrive, Institute, the ADHD Thrive and not Survive Institute,
yes.
Because to me, it's always like, they base it on you survive, you're not dying, but you're not thriving. So I think that's super important. And those tests, we will put them in the chat. But also, how can people, like, if I know this is a huge topic, and there's a lot more, like you said, we could go on for hours and hours. But what could people, how can people find out more or get in touch with you, or if you have a child with ADHD or not, or if you just want to know a little bit more about your own? And I know you focus on families and children, right? But in generally speaking, how can people find out more?
Yeah, so, my website, ADHDThriveInstitute.com, is probably the best place to go. We have a lot of information in there about, how you can improve your focus. We have a free webinar that you can attend if you want to know more. I do work with adults if I've worked with their children, because, a big part of what I do is changing the diet. And so, if you're, I'm focusing on family-friendly foods. So if you're a single male that has ADHD who's like 50, and without any children, I'm probably not the best person to work with. But, when families are involved, then yeah. So probably my website's the best to go to. But I am on YouTube as well, just like you, Claudia. And I can be found there as well under ADHD Thrive Institute.
Super cool. Yeah, and I like the family approach. I do the same thing if I do work with children in the eyesight. I always work with the families because the children, first of all, they need the guidance and the role models. And I think the adults need to really understand what is going on and look at their own health. So this was super interesting. I actually want to do these tests now. I know one is called the oats, the organic acid test.
Yes.
The first one, was that the wheat zoomer, or which one?
So the first one was the gut test. It's called a gut zoomer. It's from
gut
a lab.
zoomer.
Yeah,
Okay.
from Vibrant Wellness.
Okay.
And then the second one were the food sensitivities. We also use Vibrant Wellness. They do food zoomers and food sensitivity panel. I choose the zoomers and the food sensitivity panel because it's much more accurate than just a plain food sensitivity panels. They're definitely not created equal, that's for sure.
So food zoomer, is that the name of it? Food zoomer or food insensitivity?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ones that you can
choose
from.
Gotcha. I will just put some things on the YouTube so people.
Yeah.
When I first saw the Zoomer, like the Zoom, right? The app Zoomer.
Yeah, it actually it actually zooms into all of the mini peptides inside the protein of the actual food. So it's much more accurate.
Wow. So this was so interesting. I don't see any questions. I think you've covered a lot of different things, but I think this is something, like you said earlier, like we don't really look at, we just like, why is our vision blurry? And no matter what age, but looking at gut health, looking at the toxic exposure, looking at all this stuff that we shared today, I think this is so powerful information that most people don't know about. And I think the popping pills, I always say, like, I'm the same belief than you that sometimes Western medicine, I'm not saying it's all bad, especially when it comes to vision problems. Sometimes it's the only thing that people have access to or want or can save your health, right? So, but it's definitely not the optimal way to start or actually address the root cause. They usually just look at the symptoms. So I don't see any questions here. So thank you so much, Dana. This was super insightful. And I will stop the live stream. So YouTube, we will see you next week. And bye. Thank you so much. I put the link in the chat and on YouTube too, so that everybody has access to your information if they want to contact you. Is there anything else you want to say as a final message?
No, I just think that I think that everyone can optimize their health. I think that, you don't have to just go with what, the doctor will say. If you think of optimum health like this, 100% functioning is like optimum health. And that's like, where you want to achieve. 0% functioning is death. Symptoms don't start showing up until 50% of functioning. So you've got all this time between 50 and 100% that you could be getting, worse and worse and worse and worse. And then when you hit 50% of functioning, that's when the symptoms come out. So, don't wait until you've got the symptoms. You want to make sure that you're functioning at optimum health, no matter what.
Thank you so much. I love that example. I think that makes it super clear. So, okay, goodbye, YouTube.